So you have a lot of arguments out there that are Buddhism or Hinduism, Immanuel Kant, and theories of ethics and theories of morality and philosophy, quantum physics, evolution. And all these arguments are designed to take people ultimately out in disparate directions, away from the truth. If you do not funnel them back through what we call the narrow road, they've unraveled their own argument.
Yes.
Is how I interpreted your overall argument strategy.
Yeah, I'm grateful that you saw that. Thank you. So one of the things that it was made clear to me intuitively in prayer throughout writing this, is I'm not to argue against anybody.
Right.
This isn't to be an argument. It's just to be a statement of certain truths, which, when put together, has an explanatory power that argues itself. Okay, it doesn't have to come against anything, but it's such an integrated picture of why the world is the way it is and what God is doing about it, that because it's integrated, it's more beautiful. It doesn't require that we bite the bullet on any topic. There's a message in here that isn't explicitly stated that I was going to state in the format of New Apologetics, and it's something that the Church has more or less stated explicitly, particularly recently with the attempt to begin a New Apologetics with Scott Hahn and Father Barron. They actually have a YouTube video, and it's very much what you're saying here. And let me explain what I wanted to say that was then confirmed independently by Father Barron and Scott Hahn, is that the human will cannot attach itself to something evil for its own sake. Okay? We're not attracted to evil in itself. We're attracted to a good and evil. We're willing a good, but in a disordered way. We're holding on to a good, but in a way that sets us up against other goods. We're holding on to a truth, but we're setting ourselves in opposition to other truth. Whereas the true and the good in themselves, the ultimate truth and ultimate good, don't have any of that opposition, but take whatever is good and true and harmonize it. So there are many different people who have many different worldviews and adhere to them quite ardently and are completely unresponsive to any criticism. Okay? So entrenched worldviews, everyone defending their own piece of the true and the good. But really, what's attracting them to do that, what's attracting them to hold on to their view, is what's actually true and good about that view. And everybody is holding a piece. And in that holding of the piece, we make the mistake of thinking that if I hold my piece, I have to be against you holding your piece. But really, there's a harmony of all of these pieces. And in the Catholic faith, when it's presented authentically, it will take all of those pieces and not negate them. Take any one of those pieces and not negate them, but amplify it to its perfection and add the rest of what was erroneously excluded, mistakenly excluded. For example, and this is the perfect example, I'm unable to think of a better one. Christopher Hitchens, the infamous atheist, was very indignant about the injustices of the world. He was bitterly angry about them. And when he would debate a Christian on this topic, invariably, the Christian would come back with a retort that would diminish Christopher's position of indignation, as if the injustices he was in touch with weren't so bad, okay? And that the right thing to do would be to go along with this and say, well, there's a purpose behind it. We don't know what it is, but there's a purpose. And Christopher, it's very arrogant for you to be so upset about this. How do you know that God isn't working so good? And then Christopher would give this, fantastic example of some horror and say, well, heaven was silent in the face of... Now, the indignation seems to be, on the face of it, contrary to religious belief. That's what all of his debate partners said, or implied. That he would have to, if he became a Christian, he would have to somehow get rid of that hatred of evil. But is that so? Really, he was in touch with an aspect of reality that the Christians weren't in touch with, for the most part. And the authentic presentation of the situation that we're in, vis-a-vis evil, how does God see evil? With infinite indignation. And so, now, if Christopher were presented with the Catholic faith authentically, would he have to renounce his hatred of injustice? Would he have to rein that in at all? No. He would take that and plug it into the rest of the truth, and that hatred of evil would be holy, okay? And we have something to learn about that as a church. We're all too willing to say, oh, it's not so bad. It's not so bad that the tornado took your child and flung her across the field. God has a purpose. Not directly in that. He saves us from the purposelessness and awfulness and insult to human dignity that is by transforming it in himself. But there's no purpose for which he established. Okay? It really is the horror that it seems to be. And Christopher was right about that. So we need to return to a view, not invent, return to a view that sees evil as evil and God as good, and to understand all the truths of the faith in light of those fundamentals. And if we monkey with those fundamentals, even though we have the right words and right propositions to show forth orthodoxy, we're not orthodox because we have denied who God is and who we are. And we won't fully understand the problem and the solution that is the gospel. Really, there's the reality that the thought of there being a God who orchestrates the horrors that we experience, or don't directly experience, but other people do, who orchestrates this as a means to an end. It's so awful to think that someone is in charge of that it would be better if we were just alone. Okay? Now, in a way, that's true. Okay? In a way, that's true. If God is somehow on the side of these evils and not perfectly against them, not for us in that sense, then that's not really God anyway. That's some pagan, pseudo-God. It's something that we're projecting. It's evil. If God exists, he has to be against these evils as we are against them. And this isn't saying that we understand exactly what's good for us, that we understand the infinite good, but we do know, and the church defines, that suffering, when considered in itself, apart from the redemption, apart from what God does with it to change it, is an evil. And the church also defines, and we can argue philosophically independently of this through reason alone, that God exists and God is perfectly good, a perfect being. And if suffering is an evil, and God is infinitely good, well, God is against evil, and he's infinitely against it. There's no degree of approval. But all of the philosophical rhetoric on this topic compromises that. He's either causing it for a purpose or approving of it in some degree. He's holding back in his opposition for some purpose that uses the evil as a means to an end. And that's neither entailed by any Catholic teaching, nor is it entailed by any principles of reason, and it entails, when we take it into ourselves, it entails the total destruction of authentic hope, really, that there is goodness that we would want to be with. That there's a God who we would really want to be with. It isn't a struggle to have to, swallow this prospect of being with this person who, really isn't for us. So what I'm saying is that good is good, evil is evil, and God being good is against evil, and the church agrees, but the theorists around this have compromised and say something, they don't explicitly come out and admit it, but all of the theories imply that God is complicit in evil.
Yeah, certainly that's implied, not to interject, certainly that's implied at least in, some priests, good or bad, or,
sure.
Whatever. I think, at least I have, I've heard that, in a sermon, kind of that implication that, well, we don't really know, we just have to pray that it's for the best and that it's part of the plan, like that kind of, that phrase in particular.
Yeah, and famously, and this is not to bring Father Karapi back from the closet here, but when he was in his prime, made as the centerpiece of his preaching. And this is what he did his doctoral dissertation on. The problem of evil, his understanding of what the church had given us as the solution. And it was really a very big misunderstanding. What he said is, God permits evil in order to draw a greater good out of it, quoting Thomas Aquinas. Okay. Now, the way Father Karapi held that and taught it is that God either is causing suffering to people or is very much in approval of, say, your house burning down so that you can learn to trust God and not your finances. And when you give your permission to God to make you holy, he will run you through a gauntlet of tragedy, and it's for a greater good. And the tragedy is orchestrated by his hand. And he gave analogies when he was in the military. His drill sergeant, put one of the cadets in a closet with a snake. Well, why? To make him tougher. And he said that, God does essentially the same thing. This is a very serious problem. Aquinas' teaching doesn't entail any of that. By permits, we simply understand does not prevent. Okay? But there's a reason why he does not prevent that is something other than he gives some approval to it. He's perfectly opposed to the suffering of the innocent, just like a mother would be perfectly opposed to watching her child being tortured. God is of the same stance in a greater way than we're capable of, because our love is compromised. His love is perfect, and therefore there's even a greater opposition and a greater offense than what we're capable of echoing. Okay, so yes, Aquinas is right in that sense, but not in the way that people are holding it. It cannot be that God approves of any evil in any capacity ever.
I think from an empirical argument, suffering and all those can produce change. And that's where people then go, well, God probably did. He designed it that way. As
the observation becomes the explanation.
Yes.
And that's the danger.
It's a non
But it's coming out of Romans 8:28, and God bringing good from all situations,
does.
And this is true.
which he does.
And you talk about how he rewrites it, but he wasn't the catalyst for it.
Exactly.
In fact,
Sin was.
he
Sin, in fact, was.
reorders it. He perfectly integrates it so that not a thing is wasted and everything is maximally important to bringing about his purposes. He does that because he's perfectly opposed to it.
And this is a critical argument, I believe, that has to be won because we're losing souls turned from God because they do not believe that they're going to love this God that would allow this.
Can I read something? This is real life. This is from a book, The Power of the Powerless. It's a story. There's a young family, little boy, and a mother pregnant with what would have been this little boy's younger sister. The little girl dies shortly after birth. And this is the father talking about that. After Lauren died, we had a difficult time telling Tommy, you might have another sister. I know, he said, Mommy's going to get fat, she's going to get pregnant, she's going to get fat, go to the hospital, and the baby's going to die. Little that night, they took me down to a waiting room where Tommy was sitting all alone. Nobody else was there, and the room was poorly lit. Your sister isn't going to be coming home. Tommy, why? The thing is, Barbara, this is the mother's parents, are really religious. I think they wanted us to tell him something like, God took your little sister away because he needed her up in heaven, or something like that. I didn't want to tell him that. It made God look so bad. I didn't want him being mad at God or thinking that if he needed his sister more, maybe God would have left her with us, and then Tommy might feel guilty. It was his fault that his sister died. We just told Tommy, your sister won't be coming home. She died, Tommy. Why'd she die? She was so sick, nobody could help her. And this is the little boy then. Well, I guess God didn't listen when I prayed. I didn't know exactly what to say next. She was so sick, Tommy, even God couldn't help her. That's what I told him, because that's what I thought too. I didn't lie to him. That's what I thought. I read a book once about a man whose life falls apart, and somebody explains to him how life is like a beautiful tapestry, but only God can see the tapestry. Man looks at it from underneath and can't see the whole thing. But if man could be in God's position, he would be able to see the whole tapestry. He'd be able to see how everything fits together in a beautiful plan. That sticks up for God an awful lot, but that doesn't help people who are left behind. And besides, what type of plan could God have with Lauren's death? How could that fit into a plan? What plan could be worth sacrificing a little baby?
That's right.
But it so paints the picture that we all paint because we feel inadequate in the face of something like that.
I just wanted to add to something that I said in response to your comment about the universality and things being brought in. With this view of things, and really with the church's view of things, what's important to know in evangelization and in the work of the New Apologetics, independently of newapologetics.com, which is in telling people about God and about the gospel, nobody really has to give up anything in that way. Where what Steve read, it seems that when you say, what plan could ever justify this? What plan? And, it's the same thing that Ivan Karamazov, the atheist in the Brothers Karamazov said, no matter what you tell me, it's not worth it. Even if everyone's going to be happy in the end, at the price of one innocent person being tortured and having this beautiful thing founded on this person's unavenged tears, it's not worth it. And I won't sign on. Okay? Now, the mistake is that we think that view is opposed to what the church proposes for our belief. Everyone is making that mistake. Okay? Mm-hmm. The atheists and the Christians are making the mistake. But what Steve read, and that view, no plan that sees this as an acceptable thing is a worthy plan. That's the godly view. He's offended by the evil infinitely, and therefore the redemption is his answer to that. I saw this YouTube video with the primary philosophers of our day, both atheists and theists, talking about the problem of evil. And there was a picture of a firefighter carrying a dead child out of a building that had been destroyed in the Oklahoma City bombing. He said, whatever God's love means, it's not something like, he's not sentimental. Let's conclude that. I think that's obvious. In other words, he doesn't see what happened to this baby as being all that bad. We might see it as being unthinkably horrific, okay? But if we knew what God knows, it wouldn't be all that bad. And so his love is very different than what we would expect. And this is someone who has dedicated their life to studying philosophy. That's the best we can do. Another philosopher, the most famous Christian apologist of our time, not Catholic, William Lane Craig, talked about, perhaps God knows how to best engineer the world to have the right balance of evil, natural and moral evil, and not evil, so as to bring the most people to the greatest number, the greatest knowledge of God that it could be, so that the most will be saved. So he's directly saying God creates evil for a purpose. Quentin Smith, atheist. I knew him years ago, lost touch. He said, this is ridiculous. Look, animals eating each other. People dying of smallpox, 500 million. Count them. These were real people. It doesn't seem like anyone is in charge. That's a pretty reasonable position. The atheist is the one who is stating the purest thing in that context. The religious people are saying things that are actually an offense to God. They don't mean to. They mean to defend him, but they're really making him complicit with evil. And then Marilyn McCord Adams, author of Horrendous Evils and the Goodness of God, talking about responding to these theodicies, these explanations that construe suffering as being instructive. And no one denies that suffering can be instructive in some contexts. It's obvious. People learn a lot through making mistakes, and people learn a lot about the futility of a sinful path when their master plan falls apart. And that's, very helpful. But the problem of suffering is most manifested in those horrendous evils where it's pretty clear that they have no potential instructive value whatsoever because they just destroy a person. And I won't go into what those types of things can be. I'll spare you. But there's that counterexample to all of the rhetoric about, well, we learn from this stuff. And no one is really paying attention to that counterexample except for the atheists. But really, the Catholic faith begins with that issue of the horrendous evils, okay? And what God has done to help his suffering people. And it's through the cross and resurrection of Christ. Well, how does that help suffering people? Well, that's what this book is clarifying. But it's not introducing it new. It's really shining a light on what's already in the deposit of the faith, but no one's looking at it. And there's nothing in here that's new. You could basically rewrite the whole thing with quotes from the Catechism and from the Doctrines of the Church. But this is totally new with reference to what's in the mind of Catholics and Christians. So what has happened? We've departed from what Jesus came to say. Even though we have all the sentences right, and we believe that the Eucharist is the real presence, okay, but we've lost the basics. And so who are we even praying to? Now, obviously the real God is there and hears and answers prayer. We've departed from orthodoxy, even though we're still Orthodox. And we don't even know it. And so I think that's what he's trying to say in this book, is he's trying to clear his name, say, no, I'm really good. And he's trying to clear our names as well, in the sense that, no, the gospel really is effective. Really, you're not going to be diminished at all. There's not going to be a thing wasted. Nothing is going to be staining you for eternity. He explains in this how every element, every aspect of evil and how it diminishes us. And there are many ways of looking at it. It's not just the physical tragedies. There's the evil of being diminished by my past. My past sins are irrevocable now, right? I've done them. I can't undo them. Even when I'm in heaven and forgiven, my past will still be my past. I did this on, November 12th, 1989, and it can't be undone. I did it, and it was ugly. So now what? Am I eternally diminished? Well, no. So every way the evil afflicts the human sphere, he has countered. And he's countered it perfectly, taking away all of its power and turning it against itself. So even when there's evil, it works for a good. And so all power is taken into God's hand. And whatever the devil accomplishes works against the devil. This is through the cross. And we don't know how to preach the cross anymore because our model of explaining it is in terms of language that doesn't make sense in light of modern questions. And everybody knows that. And that's why we just don't say it. Why doesn't it make sense? Okay. Take the notion of original sin. The first man and his wife did something that they shouldn't have done, and therefore everyone suffers henceforth. And not only that, but everyone is damned a priori, independently of anything that they do, and they need to be saved by God somehow. Well, first off, let's explore the question, why does one person's sin ruin everything for everybody hence, and why would I be damned because he did something that I had no say in? Why does that separate me from God? We can't really explain that, so we don't even try. Right? We state it in the Catechism, and the Church is faithful to preserving what's been handed down in that way. But in terms of human being teaching this, we don't do it because it's obviously a sitting duck for anyone who wants to ask a question, and we don't have any way of answering them. In order to fix this situation where everybody is damned a priori, God sends his Son to be tortured to death on a cross. And this somehow makes it so that God can make us not damned. He can forgive us. But forgive us for something that we didn't even do. The baby needs this cross of Christ, resurrection of Christ, in order to not go to hell. But God just wanted to forgive us. Why did he have to torture somebody? Why was that important? Okay, well, so God's wrath is appeased because of this event where his son suffered. But isn't God changeless? God can't transition from one state to another state. That's a necessary truth of theology. So how can we understand this without implying change in God? And how can we understand this without implying conflict in God, wrath versus mercy? Why did any of this have to happen in the first place? It doesn't make a damn bit of sense in that language. And that's not blasphemous because it actually doesn't make sense. And the Pope says as much. Right? The Pope is well aware and is being careful about how he says it. He's very delicate, but I can show you quotes where he says this doesn't make sense. The notion of God's justice and mercy in conflict, and his justice needs to be satisfied so that he can give us his mercy. He says in Introduction to Christianity, way before he was Pope, this view is as false as it is widespread. Justice versus mercy? No, in the eyes of the Pope. God's justice is just as important as his mercy. Really, they're convertible to each other because God is one essence. And we break it down only in human language, and it is not that way in reality. There's love, and that's it. Justice and mercy are the same thing in God. Now, contrast that with what is in I don't want to say famous, but, well, why not? The Handbook of Catholic Apologetics. Not to throw anyone under the bus, they mean well, but the author or authors say, Jesus gets the justice and we get the mercy. Now, making the very mistake that the Pope says is entirely false. Right? But this is the Handbook of Catholic Apologetics. We don't know, even the defenders of the church, the professional apologists, don't really know what the church is teaching on this. And there's this body of information that is just a set of canned thoughts about religious questions that it's been put forth by Catholics and non-Catholics. But there's this body of information that is totally different from church teaching, but it's mistaken for church teaching. It's come into the place where church teaching should be, and it is against the Catholic faith. The notion that Jesus gets the justice, gets the wrath, and we get the mercy is contrary to the faith. But it's in the Handbook of Catholic Apologetics. There's a problem. Now,
and so hold on, just parenthetically, but the Pope agrees that that is not the case. Right? So the Pope is actually against the Handbook of Catholic Apologetics, but no one really knows it.
That's correct. Okay. That's correct. So the Pope would say, essentially, exactly what is said in Divine Justice, though he doesn't have the language yet to say it fully. And that's why I want to get this to him, because if he has this, then he can say what he knows in his heart. Right now, there aren't the concepts for him to be able to say what he knows. He knows that God is against evil. Okay? And he doesn't say anything like means to an end. He says there is a plan, and indeed there is. Okay? This is not left to chance. Nothing will be wasted or lost. That's true. He doesn't make the mistake of saying God says that this is a good way to get to the good end. That the evil is his, okay? Doesn't do that. He knows better. Okay? And he admits, and this is the crucial thing, he admits that we don't have the answers. He says, and this was in response to a little girl who got the opportunity to ask the Pope a question. Said, why do we suffer so much? Why do I have to be so afraid? We don't have the answers. But Jesus suffered as a little child. He suffered in the same way that you suffered. And we know that that is somehow important. But we don't know the answers. And isn't that humble that he admitted that?
That's the mystery of our faith, though, wouldn't you say? That the faith component to all of this type of content is key as well.
Tell me
that mystery of faith that over and over in the gospel where Jesus says, your faith has healed you, your faith has made you well. So the faith component to reach certain conclusions through the mystery of our faith and our belief. What the church teaches. You know what I'm saying?
I want to, before I answer, I want to make sure that I answer exactly the question that you're asking. When you say the mystery of the faith, what do you mean by mystery?
Exactly what the Holy Father is saying, that we don't have all the answers.
Yes.
We would be in another place entirely if we had all knowledge. Obviously the Holy Spirit brings all those gifts of the Spirit of knowledge.
Okay, fine. That's one true thing is, of course we don't have all of the answers. Mystery, as defined by the Church, does not mean something akin to the lead curtain shielding out all light and we just don't know what's behind it and we can't perceive. Mystery means actually the opposite. It means infinite intelligibility. And no matter how far we go, we can always go infinitely farther. There's always more to learn. There's always more depth. And we can never say, okay, it's done. There will always be questions, and there will always be answers to the questions. If it's possible to ask a question, it's possible to answer the question. And God is generous about drawing us forward. So, the Catholic Church's view of mystery is not the pagan view of mystery, which is darkness and obscurity. The gods know, and they're not telling you. God has revealed himself in Jesus Christ.
Right.
And has invited us to come in. Now, how does this relate to the problem of evil? It does not mean that this is all pretty clear now. No. It means that we can know that God is who he says he is. We know that he's good. We know that he doesn't in any way approve of evil. Okay? We know that he responds to evil, as Father Cantalamessa says, not with tolerance, not with aloofness. He doesn't permit it in that way where permit means tolerate, but he reacts to it, as Father Cantalamessa says, with the fullness of his holiness. Reacts to it with the fullness of his holiness. He's not holding back, okay? And we know that he's totally good, as taught to us by the Church. Now, what is this? Is this saying we got it all figured out? No. It's just preserving that God is totally good, and he reacts to evil with the fullness of his holiness. Now, is there more to learn? Yes. This is just the start of how we can vindicate those notions of God's against evil, and he's doing everything he possibly can to save us from it. How do we vindicate those essential notions from all the lies that are surrounding them? Well, this is the bare minimum for doing that. It is not saying we have it all figured out. It's defining against errors. Okay? This does not say, I understand the infinite goodness of God. I have the mind of God in my mind. No. It says, we do understand what evil is. And the Church tells us that this is an evil, that's an evil, suffering in itself is an evil, the suffering of the innocent, apart from the redemption, is an evil, okay? And that we understand what that is, for sure, and that whatever the infinite goodness of God is, it has nothing in common with that. That's all that's being said here. So it's not going into that intellectual puffery where, yes, in my mind, I have this all mapped out. Far from it. It's just getting back to the mystery. This returns us to the mystery where we can actually be on the track as beings made in the image of God. We understand what that is, and we understand who God is most basically, that we can trust him that he's good. And with that, we can just go ever deeper. So that's mystery.